In over 600 years of Ottoman history, spanning 36 different sultans, one man was crowned sultan twice. The same man was also removed from that throne twice by two entirely different palace factions in two entirely different crises, 5 years apart. No other Ottoman ruler, out of dozens across 6 centuries, ever went through that cycle even once. This wasn't a popular ruler returning triumphantly after exile, welcomed back by a grateful public. Contemporary court accounts describe him pulling the turbans off his own ministers during formal audiences, yanking their beards, wandering the palace halls, calling out for dead relatives, and throwing gold coins to birds and fish in the palace gardens as senior officials looked on. By most accounts, he may have been the least prepared man to ever sit on that throne, in an empire that stretched from North Africa to the gates of Vienna. And yet the empire put him there. Twice. This is the story of Sultan Mustafa the First, known to his own subjects as Deli Mustafa, Mad Mustafa, and why an empire this powerful kept reaching for the one man least equipped to run it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a decision made when Mustafa was still a child. For generations, Ottoman succession worked through a brutal, semi-formalized practice. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers, sometimes half a dozen of them or more, were often executed within days to eliminate any rival claim before it could spark a civil war. This wasn't considered an outrage at the time. It was considered a grim necessity, the price of a stable transition. In fact, Mustafa's own father, Ahmed III, had 19 of his own brothers strangled the day he became sultan in 1595, a mass execution so large it reportedly shocked even a public used to this practice. In 1603, Mustafa's half-brother Ahmed became sultan at just 13 years old after their father's death. Ahmed broke with that tradition. Convinced by his own mother that young Mustafa, likely still a boy himself, posed no real threat, Ahmed let his brother live. It seemed like a small act of mercy at the time. It would end up reshaping the entire Ottoman succession system for the next 3 centuries. But sparing Mustafa's life didn't mean giving him a normal one. For years, Mustafa lived inside a secluded section of Topkapi Palace known as the Kafes, the cage, a set of rooms reserved for princes who were not currently ruling, kept apart from the outside world so they couldn't build the alliances needed to plot against the reigning sultan. Earlier in Ottoman history, princes were instead sent out to govern real provinces as teenagers, learning actual statecraft under supervision. The cage replaced that entire system. It was safer for the reigning sultan. It was far worse preparation for whoever might have to rule next. No real education in statecraft, no military command, no meaningful contact with the empire he might one day be asked to rule. Just years of isolation, waiting for a throne he was never actually trained to sit on. Modern historians widely point to this isolation as a likely factor behind the mental instability that would define the rest of his life, whatever underlying condition he may also have had. The cage was designed to protect the throne from ambitious princes. Nobody seemed to plan for what happens when the throne eventually needs the prince it had locked away. That moment arrived in 1617, when Sultan Ahmed I died. By the older tradition of direct inheritance, the throne might have passed straight to Ahmed's own son, Osman, still only a teenager himself. Instead, a palace faction, led by the empire's top religious authority, the Sheikh al-Islam, and a senior statesman named Sofu Mehmed Pasha, made a very different choice. They argued Osman was too young and inexperienced to take the throne without provoking unrest. Even the palace's own chief eunuch reportedly objected, pointing directly at Mustafa's mental problems as a disqualifying issue. He was overruled. They enthroned Mustafa instead. This single decision quietly created a brand new rule for Ottoman succession going forward: seniority. From this point on, the throne would generally pass to the oldest surviving male in the dynasty, not directly from father to son. That rule would govern the Ottoman Empire for the rest of its existence. And its very first application had just placed a man with no training, no experience, and documented mental instability in charge of one of the most powerful empires on earth. Mustafa's first reign lasted about 3 months. Court accounts from the period describe genuinely strange behavior, pulling the turbans off viziers during official audiences, yanking their beards, wandering through the palace grounds, throwing gold coins to birds and fish in the gardens. His mother effectively ran the government in his name, because he clearly could not. By February of 1618, a different palace faction had seen enough. Mustafa was deposed and sent back to the cage. His nephew, 14-year-old Osman II, took the throne instead. For most rulers, that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. Osman II's reign collapsed after a failed military campaign against Poland and a deeply unpopular plan, disbanding the powerful Janissary military corps and replacing them with a new army recruited from the provinces and loyal directly to him. He had also announced plans to leave Constantinople on the pretext of a pilgrimage, a move many suspected was really cover for gathering that new loyal army far from the capital's watching eyes. In May of 1622, Janissary and cavalry soldiers rebelled, seized Osman, and executed him. It was the first time in Ottoman history that a reigning sultan had been executed by his own soldiers, an event so shocking that it permanently changed how future sultans viewed their own military. The empire suddenly needed a new sultan, immediately, with no obvious candidate ready. Osman's own young son wasn't considered a viable option in the chaos of the moment, and no other adult male of the dynasty was readily available. So the same rebels who had just killed one, Sultan reached for the only other dynastically qualified adult they had, the man they themselves had helped depose 4 years earlier. They pulled Mustafa back out of the cage, still confined there since 1618, and crowned him Sultan for a second time on May the 20th, 1622. Mustafa opened his second reign by ordering the execution of several men involved in killing Osman, an attempt to legitimize his own sudden return to power. It didn't stabilize much of anything. Conflict broke out between the Janissaries and the Sipahi cavalry, two branches of the same military that had just killed an emperor between them and now turned on each other over influence at court. A provincial governor named Abaza Mehmed Pasha launched an open rebellion in the eastern provinces, partly in the name of avenging the murdered Osman, dragging the empire into fighting a civil conflict on top of everything else. Something interesting happened in how people talked about Mustafa during this second reign. Early on, chroniclers had called him Deli Mustafa, Mad Mustafa, but as his second reign wore on, some began calling him something else entirely. Veli Mustafa, Saintly Mustafa, reframing his condition not as madness, but as a kind of holy simplicity, a man too pure and detached from worldly ambition to be judged by ordinary standards. It's a striking reminder that madness and sainthood were, at the time, sometimes just two different stories people told about the exact same behavior, depending on whether it suited those in power to explain him away or to elevate him. Neither label came from any medical examination. Both came from people trying to make sense of, or make use of, a man they had put on the throne without ever really asking whether he wanted to be there. Neither framing changed the practical reality, an empire in crisis, run in name only by a man who had never been prepared to run anything. By September of 1623, senior clerics and the Grand Vizier had had enough. Rather than moving against Mustafa directly, they went to the one person whose blessing could make the deposition stick without triggering more violence, his own mother. They persuaded her to allow his second deposition, arguing it was the only way to save what remained of the dynasty's stability. His 11-year-old nephew, Murad IV, was placed on the throne instead. Unlike Osman II, Mustafa wasn't executed this time. He was allowed to live out the rest of his life within the palace walls that had confined him for most of his adulthood already, likely because his condition made him look harmless rather than dangerous to whoever now held real power. He lived another 16 years after his final deposition, largely out of public view. He died in January of 1639 in his late 40s and was buried in a mausoleum beside the Hagia Sophia, the same building that had witnessed both of his coronations decades apart. So why does this matter beyond one unlucky man's strange life? Because the succession rule his first enthronement created, seniority over direct inheritance, didn't end with him. It became standard Ottoman practice for centuries afterward, all the way to the empire's final decades in the early 20th century, shaping who could and couldn't become sultan long after Mustafa himself, and everyone who remembered him, was gone. The old system, killing potential rival brothers, was designed to prevent one very specific kind of crisis, violent succession wars. The new system that replaced it solved that problem well enough. Large-scale fratricide effectively ended. But it created a quieter, slower-moving one, a rule that could, and twice actually did, hand the entire empire to whoever happened to be next in line by age alone, regardless of readiness, temperament, education, or health. Nobody sat down and designed that outcome on purpose. It simply fell out of a rule built to solve a completely different problem, and nobody involved seemed to notice the new risk they had created until it had already happened once. Mustafa never asked to rule twice. He didn't campaign for it, plot for it, or even seem to want it in any of the accounts that survive. He was simply the only person left who technically qualified, both times, according to a rule his own accidental survival, as a boy his brother chose to spare, had helped create in the first place. It's worth asking the same question about the systems around you today. When we build a rule to fix one specific failure, how often do we check what new failure that same rule might quietly guarantee years down the line to somebody who never chose to be standing in that spot?